Let's have an honest, frank discussion about the anatomy, probably the wrong word, of a rebuild in the NBA. Next on Locked on Jazz. Bum.
You are Locked on Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
How are you? I'm David Locke, radio voice of the Utah Jazz, Jazz NBA insider. This is Locked on Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz, giving you insight, expertise, geeky numbers, and hopefully making it way better to be a Jazz fan each and every day. Thank you so much for making Locked on Jazz your first listen. On today's show, we're going to dig into what I'm going to call the anatomy of a rebuild and what it really takes to get it done and how long it takes to get it done and what you're trying to get done, and hopefully give us a better understanding of what we're in the midst of and how long it's going to last. That's the goal today on the show. As I mentioned, we are Locked on Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Thank you for making Locked on Jazz your first listen of the day, as well as thank you for the everydayers who are out there. We are free and available on all podcasting apps as well as YouTube. So thank you very much for tuning in. 5-star reviews are always welcome. Thank you to the various emails for yesterday's show. I did like that one. I'm glad you did as well. All right. Here's what we're going to walk through. We're going to set, if we were literally presenting this to how it works. And I just want to make sure we all kind of have it. So in a rebuild in the NBA, your goal is to get a top 10 player, a top 20 player, and a top 50 player. That's how you win a championship. Ideally, top 10, top 20, and top 50, or top 30. But you're trying to get really these three pieces. And to do it, you're going to work inside of two molds. One is asset accumulation windows, and the other is talent accumulation windows. So the talent accumulation windows are where you're trying to go get your 10, your 20, and your 50. Once you have those, you just put the pieces around it. That once you get those or something close to it, then you actually just go into pure talent accumulation mode where you're actually now putting the Jay Crowders and the pieces around your roster. You're like what Phoenix did with Grayson Allen, and you're going to give up assets for that. Now that's kind of all in, right? So that's third stage is all in. And so what you're doing is playing a little bit between the two for a while. When the window presents itself for talent accumulation, which is really the draft at that point, you'll do it. But you're still, for a little while, in any rebuild, you're in an asset accumulation window. So, and you have these windows, and this is what I think makes the rebuild difficult and long, and I did a little of this on Monday, the everydayer, so I apologize. I just thought I did it really badly. So I'm coming back today with a better organization, better examples, and trying to really show you what I was trying to allude to in a very truncated and not very good manner on Monday. And hopefully this will give you kind of an understanding of what you do as a franchise. So you have these two windows or these two processes, asset accumulation and talent accumulation. And the problem is that makes it long is they only happen in limited times. So the primary talent accumulation is drafts. And if you're Utah or anywhere other, let's rephrase this. If you're anywhere other than Miami, Los Angeles, perceived to be New York City, maybe Golden State, you don't actually have a free agency window by which to work with. Okay? Utah can't play free agency. Nor can Oklahoma City, nor can Cleveland, nor can Detroit, nor can Minnesota, nor can Orlando, really, frankly, yet to prove that they can do that very regularly. Nor can Houston, despite the fact they did the little, really been a failure. Nor can Dallas, which is a pretty awesome city. Phoenix evidently can, maybe a little. So, and Phoenix is a really interesting one in how they've done this. We should probably look at Phoenix a little bit here. It's been rocky and they made some mistakes. I hadn't used them as a model, but if we have time today, on the fly, we'll look at them as a model. So your first talent acquisition windows or accumulation windows are just drafts. You're really going to have almost an impossible time trading for anyone who's going to be a 10, a 20, or a 50 at that point along the way. You are going to take flyers on what we call second draft players. Talon, second team players. Colin Sexton, perfect. Very, very skilled. Absolutely have something in there. Is it something that can become like a piece? And you try it. Lucas Samanic, perfectly done. That's in the stage one, you're drafting and you're finding players that another team has moved on from that have some real talent, might have been a top draft pick to see. That's why I was in love with Jalen Suggs. I would have overpaid for him, but okay. And the other one's asset accumulation. So if you walk through where we are, our very first window was both. Asset accumulation. We got all the picks for Donovan, all the picks for Rudy. We moved Bojan for very little. Pick-wise, we got space, which allowed us to do another deal later. And we got Lowry, and then we got Lowry. Indirectly, we also kind of had our first talent accumulation window where we got Ochai and we got Walker. And we'll see whether either of them become top 50 players. Walker was a late draft pick, but he's 7 feet tall. Lowry gives us a top 50 piece. Then we go through our next window was the trade deadline of last year. And we were still in asset accumulation mode. We frankly were winning a lot of games. Wasn't entirely intention, I don't think, but we played it out. We played the game. And we then moved Mike and Vandy and Malik and took Russell's contract, and we got another first-round draft pick, which are hard to get. I don't think you'll see another one. I don't think you'll see someone get one this year. We haven't seen anyone get one in a while. So that was great. And there was no talent accumulation there. So then our next step is window number 3, which was talent accumulation in the draft. And we got Taylor, and we got Keontae, and we got Bryce. And we shall see of whether or not they become a top 10, top 20, or top 50 player in the NBA. So far, Keontae is growing nicely, and Taylor's skills are clear to why we drafted him. And Bryce is having a great run in the G League, but he's also the 28th pick of a draft. They rarely become that. They can become a piece of a puzzle or something, but right. Okay. So that's where we are right now. This trade deadline will be an asset accumulation, and I don't think it'll be very fruitful. We may move some people, but the new collective bargaining agreement restricts how easily it is for us to move them. We're probably not just going to be able to take salary off somebody. We could get a pretty good pick from someone if we get them under the apron. That might be our value, is getting people under the apron. But I think it's going to be hard to go get like another first-round pick. I'll be stunned if Justin and Danny are able to go get another first-round pick. The collective bargaining agreement doesn't line up for it very well. None of our guys have had particularly good runs right now that make them even more appealing. And so that'll be our next asset accumulation window. We will then have a few more asset accumulation windows upcoming when teams are in financial distress and we're not. And that's harder now under the new collective bargaining agreement, the way I read it. And it's what Oklahoma City did, though, on a bunch of little trades here and there, and it improves your lot. You can do some things to get better and improve your assets through that. But for the most part, we're done with massive asset accumulation. We're through that process because we used it for Donovan. We used it for Rudy. We used it for Mike. We've traded Bojan. Like, we're done with asset accumulation at this point. We have a lot, a huge amount. It's been a win. And so now we move into talent accumulation. And how long does talent accumulation take before you have a 10, a 20, and a 50 when your windows are really once, maybe twice a year? So let's look at the perfect model that everyone's in love with of Oklahoma City, who's done it about as quickly as possible. And let's look at the single greatest rebuild ever in the history of the NBA and see how long it took them and look back at some of the Jazz circumstances. So we'll do both of those as we continue. We're just getting started here on Locked On Jazz on today's edition. We'll look at the single greatest rebuild in the history of the NBA, and we'll look at Oklahoma City, who's the pride and joy of everything, and we'll look back at some of the Jazz stuff to get a concept of what we're looking at and how long this will take. Today's show is brought to you by eBay Motors, as well as your guaranteed fit of the week. It's eBay Motors Guaranteed Fit of the Week, fantasy picks of the week for you. Let's look at it. We tap into Josh Lloyd, Locked On Fantasy Basketball's host and the number one fantasy show in the world of what you need to do this week, all in eBay Motors Guaranteed Fit of the Week. Dante Exum gets a call out here. Mavs are struck down by injuries, and Exum has looked like a solid ad. Keontae George turned in a big game Monday and isn't letting go of the Jazz starting point guard spot. Field goal percentage will be shaky, but I like his opportunity. Another rookie, Asur Thompson. If Thompson was dropped, go grab him. He's back in the starting, and hopefully Monty Williams has realized his error. And tonight we'll see Isaiah Hartenstein, who with Mitchell Robinson out for 8 to 10 weeks. Hartenstein's the guy I look to, even though Jerikai Sims is starting. Hartenstein will close the game on Monday. And the final drop here from Josh Lloyd is look at Jonathan Kuminga, a bit of a left field pick. Kuminga has jumped in the last 2 games, and the Warriors are floundering. Perhaps he could be a solid run of minutes over the next 2 weeks. Those are Josh Lloyd, Locked On Fantasy Basketball's eBay Guaranteed Fit fantasy picks of the week. It's all brought to you by the great people over at eBay. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you can make sure your ride or die stays running smoothly. Brake kits, LED headlights, roof racks, bumpers, whatever your baby needs, eBay Motors has it. And with eBay Motors Guaranteed Fit, it's guaranteed to fit your ride from time. Each time, your money back. Plus, at these prices, you're burning rubber, not cash. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit on all, only available to U.S. customers, eligible items, and exclusions do apply. All right, the anatomy of a rebuild we've laid out for you. Now let's look at some examples of surgery. Okay, that was a bad analogy. So Oklahoma City and the Utah Jazz are unique in this sense. They're the first teams to really do these rebuilds in which they traded really good players and got a bunch of assets. Okay, so that's the uniqueness of both where the Jazz and Oklahoma City sit, is that the Jazz traded Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert, Mike Conley, and the Thunder traded Paul George and Russell Westbrook and got a ton for them. The truth is that the rebuild for the Thunder was supposed to start in 2020, and Chris Paul just won too many games. So that actually kind of screwed them up if you actually go back. So in 2021, they win 22 games. They go 22-50. They're outscored by 11 points a game. They're the worst team in the NBA. So they were awful. And then they kind of start their process. And this is where they end up in their first asset accumulation window. And they go and make a bunch of trades, do a bunch of things, add some more assets. But they end up drafting for their roster Josh Giddey and Trey Mann. And that's their first window is 2021. Now they continue into asset accumulation mode here a little bit. Different collective bargaining agreement. They had all sorts of cap space. They would make moves. They actually traded their 16th pick for 2 more picks, actually, which conveyed. They took Derek Favors in 2020 on July 30th of 2021 because we were strapped financially and overpaid, and they got this pick that's looming for us all the way through 2027, and an incredible deal for them. So they've continued into asset accumulation mode. That's a little bit of what we're going to try to do here in a few of these windows and see if we can just add 1 or 2 more by being the outlet for people financially. Little harder in this collective bargaining agreement to be done, though, worth noting. And then in the second draft, they get their second acquisition window. And remember, their first one is Shea. Their second one is Josh Giddey and Trey Mann. Their third one is Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams. My goodness, did they hit. Right? They may have done their 10-20. Their third window is Cason Wallace, who they just did. And now they're putting the pieces around it, and time's going to tell. But right now, they seem to be rolling. So they got this done incredibly in 3 windows. I don't know that because the player they traded for and had on their roster was a top 10 player in the NBA. They like Shea. They added a top 10 player in the world. Who knew? Great for them. And then they had 2 awful years where they ranked last basically in the NBA in differential. And they ended up with a second draft of Chet Holmgren and Jalen Williams, which is really, that's what we've got to do. We've got to have our Chet Holmgren, Jalen Williams draft here at some point. Now, the greatest rebuild in the history of the NBA is the Golden State Warriors. So in 2009, the Golden State Warriors won 29 games, and they had Monte Ellis and David Lee on a roster that was pretty decent. And they're able out, and they hold on to them for a while, and they end up getting, by the way, just so we have it now, nothing for David Lee, and they get a nice piece for Monte Ellis. So they do a little bit of this, but not the same way with picks and all of that. So the Golden State Warriors in 2008-9 win 29 games and draft Steph Curry. The year before, they had not made the playoffs with Don Nelson, and then they lost 20 games. This next year, they win 26 games, so they're terrible again. Their differential's -8. And they end up drafting the 5th pick of the draft, and they draft Ekpe Udoh. So they miss, because that happens. They are not really able to use trades or anything like that. They win 36 games, and they trade David Lee at this point, but they really get nothing for him. They're now opening the deck up to let Steph Curry go and roll. In 2010, they win 36 games. So they go 29, 26, 36. And they draft Klay Thompson. So they've drafted 2 Hall of Famers in 3 years. This is how you do it. They have a top 10, and now they're going to have a top 20. In the 11-12, they then go 23-43, which is like about a pace of a 30-win season, was 66-game season. So they win about 30 games. So they've now got 29, 26, 36, 30, 4 years on the greatest rebuild in the history of the NBA. And at which point they draft Harrison Barnes. So in their 4th talent acquisition window, they've gotten Steph Curry, Ekpe Udoh, Klay Thompson, and Harrison Barnes. They also got, now they trade Monte Ellis and get Andrew Bogut, former number 1 pick. Nice job. So they create another asset accumulation window with one of their players. They decide it's time to move on from Monte Ellis, and they go get an established talent acquisition right there in a window. So they've now used 4 windows. They have Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Harrison Barnes, and Andrew Bogut. That's great. And then they hit the jackpot with another draft pick that year, and they draft Draymond Green. And they trade Steven Jackson, which turns into Festus Ezeli, and then by then they're into the playoffs. I mean, it's truly the greatest rebuild ever. But it's 4 years, 29, 26 wins, 36 wins, 30 wins, 4 years. And in that, Steph Curry, Ekpe Udoh, Klay Thompson, Harrison Barnes, Andrew Bogut, and Draymond Green. That's the greatest rebuild in the history of the NBA. It took 4 years. And it was perfectly done. That should give us a little bit of an idea of the time it takes for this. That's doing it without a free agent. That's drafting your talent. That's taking your existing pieces in Monte Ellis and David Lee, who'd both been all-stars, and doing what you can later in the process, getting an Andrew Bogut, getting nothing for Lee. And then they were 47-35 under Mark Jackson, made the playoffs. And then they add Steve Kerr, and they go 67-15, and they really get rolling, right? And then they go to 73-9, and then they add Durant, and they win. It's the greatest rebuild of all time. The Jazz are interesting because we've kind of did this a little bit under Dennis Lindsey. So let's look at that next. And then we'll do a ad lib and look at Phoenix, because we've looked at Oklahoma City. We looked at Golden State, 2 great models. Let's look at what we actually did in our own world. And I apologize. My son, who is flying back from Europe, just texted me. So let me make sure there's nothing wrong. Okay. All right. Sorry. Real life checks in, even if you're recording the podcast. So where was I? We're going to look at Utah, and we'll try to do Houston on the fly coming up. That was not the, nothing is seriously wrong, but that was not the greatest message. So I'm trying to refocus. All right. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is the official ticketing app of Locked On, and it's great for various reasons. So let's run through what I like the most about why I use Game Time. I used them for Pink in Indianapolis this season. I'll use them for some other events, Holiday Bowl, Christmas presents for people. So why? It's the only ticketing app that gives you the peace of mind of your purchase. So you see the view from your seat before you buy, so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. You get all-in prices, show your total up front, so you know what you're great without hidden fees, and you buy your tickets in seconds with just 2 taps. Plus, they have the Game Time Guarantee, which the Game Time Guarantee means you always get the best price, where you'll find tickets in the same section, a row for less. Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. With zone deals, you pick the section, Game Time picks the seats, and you can save 18% along the way. So take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA, and get 20% off your first purchase. That's 20% off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code, spell out LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. So let's look back at what Dennis Lindsey did, because he did it to start really, really, really well. So we go through the 13-14 season and go 29 or 13-14 season and go 25-57. Tyrone Corbin's last year, and he gets fired. And we draft Trey Burke and Rudy Gobert. So we hit on Rudy. And we are in asset accumulation mode as well as that's our talent accumulation. We're in asset accumulation mode. He makes a trade, moves some pieces. Andre Iguodala trade. We allow that to get to Golden State and all sorts of stuff. And we end up with a 2014 first-round pick out of that deal. Very similar to the Mike Conley deal. Very, very similar to the Mike Conley deal. And that pick actually becomes the next 2014. We have 2 picks, and we draft Rodney Hood. So nice pickup there. Probably not a 10, probably not a 20, probably not a 50. We got one of our 10, 20s, or 50 with Rudy Gobert. We have the 5th pick of the draft. After the 25-57 season, we used the 5th pick on Dante Exum. We also, by the way, grab interesting little things. We weren't really in full rebuild. We just kind of we pick up Joe Ingles off the Clippers. We signed Trevor Booker. We still have Alec Burks, Derek Favors, Enes Kanter on our roster. And we're unable in that rebuild, looking back, to be able to move any of those pieces for any more asset accumulation. We try, but we don't get it done. They're just not at a stage in their careers, or they don't do enough. They just didn't move the meter on the market. So I probably set this up wrong. We start with Gordon, right? We still have Gordon, and Gordon's developing, former 9th pick of the draft. Then we draft Trey, and we hit Rudy. Now we've got 2 top 50s when Rudy clicks in a few years later. And Gordon was great then. We try to get another one with Exum, we miss. We go get Hood. We add some pieces early. So we go into talent accumulation mode really early in this rebuild. With Joe Ingles, great pickup. Trevor Booker, great pickup. And we have Burks, Favors, and Kanter on the roster. We trade Kanter for nothing. We just get rid of him. He's being a pain. And the 2015 draft comes, we draft Trey Lyles. So now at this point, 2015, Trey Burke's not panning out great. Exum's still coming around, not panning out great. We have Hayward, we have Gobert. And we get to the 2016 draft, and we decide we're done with asset accumulation. Gobert and Hayward are good enough. We're going full in, all chips in, third stage talent accumulation mode. And we trade our pick for George Hill. We trade Trey Burke. We don't get anything in return. We sign Joe Johnson. We're in talent accumulation mode at this point. But we're not. And then we trade for Ricky Rubio. So there's like three stages, right? There's asset accumulation. There's trade. There's talent accumulation, which is the draft and some of those pieces, second draft kinds. And then there's like, oh, let's go get the veterans and fill in the pieces. In a 2020 hindsight, we could argue this was early. But I'm guessing there wasn't a real stomach for losing around here. But we go to George Hill, Joe Johnson, Ricky Rubio to surround them with Gordon Hayward and Rudy Gobert. We don't have a 10 yet. Rudy might have become a 50 and Hayward might have been a 20. Probably not by then. But we go in. And then 2017, we hit the jackpot. We draft Donovan. And that changes everything, right? That gives us 2 20s. Gordon leaves us. And then we go along the way with talent and add Boyan and add Conley to get to our 250s. And we're really, really good. We're the number 1 seed. It's a decent model of what we're talking about here. It might be, in retrospect, slightly rushed. Right? We went through one talent acquisition window with Trey Burke and Rudy Gobert. We went through the second with Exum Hood. Went through the third with Trey Lyles. And through that, we had gotten Rudy Gobert. So we hadn't had super big success in those draft picks. Trey wasn't panning out. Dante wasn't panning out. Trey Lyles was not a good fit. And we had Rudy. So through three windows, we had a bad draft too coming up. We had Hayward and we had Gobert and we went all in. We went to George Hill. We went to Joe Johnson. We went to Ricky Rubio before the 2017 draft. Those were our next set of moves. So I don't know. I'm just looking at it. Like Golden State took 4 years. We took 3, won a bunch of games in there. Quinn did an unbelievable job in those first 2 years, so we didn't feel it. And maybe the fact was that Quinn was just winning too much. Phoenix is super interesting. We're not going to have a lot of time to do Phoenix here, but Phoenix is super interesting because what Phoenix did is a little bit got caught. If you go back, Phoenix goes into full rebuild mode and goes 25-57 in 2012, 2013. And they have Alvin Gentry, Lindsey Hunter, and they end up then drafting the 5th pick of the draft, and they draft Alex Len in the 2017 or the 2013 draft. And Jeff Hornacek becomes their head coach in the 13-14 season, and they end up making a bunch of moves. Like they trade Luis Scola to get off of his contract. They trade Jared Dudley. They trade a bunch of their pieces. And they trade Marcin Gortat. They had these pretty good players. Well, they end up being like surprisingly good. They kind of stun everyone. And they get the 14th pick of the draft, and they've acquired the 18th pick of the draft, and they draft TJ Warren, and they draft Tyler Ennis, who doesn't turn out. And then what's interesting is because they won 48 games, they kind of go all in. They go sign PJ Tucker. They trade for Isaiah Thomas. They sign Eric Bledsoe to a multi-year deal. Like their rebuild's kind of over at that point. They're trying to go get players. They end up going 39-43 the next year. They don't make the playoffs. They're a part of a bunch of different trades at the trade deadline that year, trying to get the team better. They trade Isaiah Thomas to Boston. They trade Goran Dragic to Miami. They kind of realize, oh, crap, we rushed this, and now we should be moving our pieces. And they start into asset accumulation mode, and they go to the draft of 2015, and they draft Devin Booker. Okay. Well, now they're actually back into full build remold. Like, they literally for 18 months went, woo, and then went, ah, and they pull out of it. So now they've had their first window. I'm doing this on the fly. I mean, I remember it. And they go 23-59, and they fire Jeff Hornacek because I don't know why. Because they forgot they were in a rebuild. And they hire Earl Watson, which turns out and they get the 4th pick of the draft in their next acquisition window, and they draft Dragan Bender. And they draft Georgios Papagiannis, and they draft Skal Labissiere in their 3 first-round draft picks that they've acquired through the 2015 trade deadline. So they go 0 for 3 in that window. Now, the next year, they're 24-58. So they are now kind of in and then out. Now they're in 2 deep years of hell of losing. They're the worst team in the NBA. And they go in the draft and they draft Josh Jackson with the 4th pick of the draft, who turns out to be another miss. So they suddenly have missed on they hit on Devin Booker and miss on everything else. 3 games into the year, they fire Earl Watson. They go 21-61. I mean, this is like an unmitigated mess. They trade Eric Bledsoe finally. They get really nothing for him. They get a first-round pick, which actually ends up getting moved around eventually and becomes Desmond Bane from Memphis. And they get the very first pick of the draft, and they draft DeAndre Ayton instead of Luka Doncic. And then they go 1963 with Igor. And they blame Igor. And then they draft the 6th pick of the draft, and they draft Jarrett Culver. I mean, it's incredible. And then Monty Williams comes in, and they have Devin Booker. Out of all of that, they have Devin Booker. And then they go get Chris Paul. They decide, we got to go do real pieces here. And they go get Chris Paul. And, it's interesting, right? They have DeAndre Ayton, the number 1 pick. They have Devin Booker. They have Ricky Rubio at the time. Actually, Rubio's the first year with Monty Williams at 34 and 39. And then they go get Chris Paul. And they end up in the NBA Finals. So there's not a strict how-to. And they draft Mikal Bridges, who's a rookie, becomes really good. And then all of a sudden, they have Chris Paul top 10, and Devin Booker's emerging, and DeAndre Ayton's okay, and they get to the NBA Finals. And now they've kind of just stepped on this thing, and they're staying all in all the time. They've gotten rid of all their picks, and they're doing it with Kevin Durant, Bradley Beal, and Devin Booker. Devin Booker's top 10, Kevin Durant's top 10, and Bradley Beal's top 50. They got a real chance. But after their aborted one, they went through 4 years, 23, 24, 21, 19 to get to where they back are where they are today. They're interesting because theirs went awry, and then they pivoted. That is Locked on Jazz today. That is the anatomy of a rebuild. We got some time. Enjoy it. Watch it. Enjoy the depth, the growth, the pieces, the various accumulation windows. They're small. Understand what wins are right now. Wins right now for us are talent development. And if we somehow turn pieces of our puzzle right now into new assets, it's a huge win because our asset accumulation mode should be closed. There is not much left in asset accumulation mode. We're into talent accumulation mode, but they're just very hard to find, those windows. We'll see whether or not how it plays out. Can the trade deadline yield something? I feel like it's unlikely. But every game yields us a little more for Keontae, a little more exposure for our guys, and we see the pieces coming. We see Ochai, we see Walker, we see Lowry, and which of these pieces become our 10, our 20, and our 50. Have a good one. Now I send you over to the first ever 24/7 national YouTube stream for sports. It's Locked On Sports Today on YouTube. Please subscribe. If you're on audio, please jump over and check it out. Have a great day. Talk to you soon.